This is Awake In from Counseling in Schools, where we share our voice on the potential and possibilities, challenges, and celebrations of children, families, and staff in New York City schools. Awake In is conversations about commitment to the emotional and social growth of children so they can thrive in school and succeed in life. Welcome in.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Awaken. This is your host, Kat Potts, and I'm back here with Kevin Dahill-Fuchel. Hey Kevin.
Hey Kat.
Glad to have you back. I look forward to our weekly conversations. Today, everyone, we're going to be talking about the story of the pivot, how counseling in schools was able to pivot to going from in-person to virtual. And there's a couple different buckets here, right? There's the emotional toll it takes, there's the productivity toll, technology, privilege. So I kind of want to just start off with one of those buckets there, Kevin.
Yeah, well, those are the big ones. A lot to fill in any of them. And I guess, the first thing that comes to mind is just the space that we work in and the people who work for counseling in schools. There's a sense that we're kind of prepared for a lot. If you work in a school environment, providing social emotional support services, no one day really looks like any other, right? So there's certainly a sense that as an organization, as a staff, we were not sort of sitting in some very rigid routines. We certainly had expectations for, going to a building and, doing those things. So it was not like it was nothing, but there was something about it that, we're always responding to what our clients experiencing. And while we were all experiencing it, I think none of us really left the idea that, the students and the families and the communities that we work with were really at a different level of peril with the idea of being isolated and disconnected. And for us to really kind of desperately initially make sure that we did not let go of those relationships, that we maintained that connection, that we didn't just sort of sink into the disconnection. I felt that from across our organization, and I know I feel that, I felt that, I still do, this sense of, real compelling need to stay engaged. And to not let go of the rope kind of thing. So I think that would be my platform piece for all of the buckets that ended up being then things that we were going to pivot to and manage and work with and all of that. But it was like, do not lose connection.
Right. That's what I hear you're saying, because it's sort of like some people may argue, this pandemic is like a once in a lifetime type of thing that we might experience. But it also raises the question sort of like, is it though? And then what do we prioritize? And I think what I'm hearing you say is like the connection is the biggest thing. And like, if you're focusing in on the connection, then we can look at like, what does that mean for all of these other buckets, right?
Definitely. And I'm so glad you said, this is a once in a lifetime, but is it? Because I think, I would say that relationship building and connectivity was one of the bigger elements of what we're there to do anyway. I mean, for so many families and students and communities, there's a real sense that they are invisible or just disconnected from what the mainstream of our sort of society is doing, right? So we can see all of the, wonderful opportunities and the different types of consumer opportunities that are there. And there are folks who we know just live every day and looking at that as a little bit like, like it's Oz, like it's just not really their reality. And so for us working with students and families in, communities like that, like we've wanted to build and needed to build those connections to sort of say, like, you're not invisible, you're here. We are, where is your voice? What is your experience? Let's make sure that you're a part of the equation. And so when the pandemic hit, it was really just like even more of that, right? Like to your point, like I really, sometimes it's hard to articulate this in a way that like comes across as clearly as I feel it. But I really think that that COVID-19 did not create a lot of scenarios. It just made it impossible for us not to see them. Whereas before, so many situations were so easily dismissed or made invisible or put off on, blaming people for, oh, well, that's because of this. And I'm spared of those problems because I have, earned this kind of thing. Not thinking about privilege, not thinking about all those other things.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is privilege, right? I think came to the forefront because there's it's one of those things that for some people can be out of sight, out of mind, right? It doesn't really exist. But then there are tons of, children and families that don't have access to internet to be able to get in touch with who they need to and school, or they don't have laptops or computers for enough of their children. And that, that was a huge thing that before some people could ignore, but then how do you do that now?
Right. And it was, it was not it was relevant in a real way prior to the pandemic. A lot of New York City public schools are using web-based systems to send homework home, to send messages to parents, to, give parents access to various events that are coming up, all of these things happening through the internet. And, certain students were always struggling with that. Certainly students living in temporary housing, which certainly raised to the fore where, a lot of the buildings that are used as temporary housing facilities do not have internet or did not have, and some still do not have internet there. Right. So those students were always kind of in this analog space where everybody else was digitally working, and they were kind of left behind or getting the information, but kind of not really in the same way or as efficiently as everybody else. So it wasn't like it wasn't there, but again, it wasn't lifted up,
right, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that makes sense because where I went to school, originally from New Jersey, the private school that I went to, everybody had to have the same laptop, right? And so I think about that a lot because I'm like, we all had these laptops outside of the stuff that we had at home. We had to have that in order to even be at school, right? And then but then I think now I'm like, and I should have been thinking it then, but I'm like, what if someone didn't have access to those things or couldn't afford that or what if, it's just now over a decade later, I'm thinking about these things, right?
Yeah, right. And they existed then, right? They existed.
They did. Yeah, they existed then.
They existed then. And again, it was just sort of like, maybe it was a concern of some, folks or government entities, but it was sort of like, yeah, we'll get to that. But what we really need to do is these other things. And, that's why I say COVID came and it just lifted these things that were otherwise ignored and just put them in front of everybody and said, you now have to deal with all of this.
Right.
You can't not deal with it. And I think that, for us, again, back to this idea of well, what did we do? How did we pivot into this? It was those relationships that we had built that meant that we had working phone numbers for people because we weren't reliant on the internet for our connections with them before. And we had lots of communication. So when we knew, when school systems or other teachers or folks were really going to say but I don't know where this person is and I don't know if they're okay. And how do we find out? They're not emailing me. It's well, they probably aren't emailing anybody. We and certainly people have phones and connect, but they're not doing that. And so, or you don't have the right number and those kind of things. So that was really, one of the things we immediately did, all of our staff right away, March 24th, 2020, which was the first full week school was back in session prior, after
almost 2 years ago to the date.
Almost 2 years ago to the day. Absolutely insane. We then, we're immediately gathering all of the phone numbers, making, who do we know? How can we be in touch? And that was really the start then of being able to kind of do some of the work to say, okay, who needs these resources and how do we get them connected to those things?
So did your goals with certain entities kind of change when COVID hit? Did you have to kind of change what your goals were? Were you in the middle of working on things that had to kind of pause because now you have this sort of immediate experience that you have to address?
Absolutely. Yeah. The outcomes that everybody wanted were the same, but the initial goals, this is going to become so repetitive in this conversation, Kat, but the initial goal was connection, right? So that was just sort of and making sure that people knew that we were there and how to be in touch with us. and we had, Google phones and all
You
kinds of other
created
ways,
resources.
creative resources. Yep.
Right.
How could they connect to us? Another thing that really changed right away, we were in the midst of a lot of work with a number of different schools on doing capacity building with their staff to be able to relate to their students. And those teachers were able to be in touch with us, and those school staff were in touch with us. But because the city was saying that, all that kind of training was all set up to happen in person, they actually canceled all of our contracts to do any of the teacher training. And teachers were reaching out to us like desperate because they didn't know how to stay connected, and they were going through something difficult and they wanted the support. So what we were able to do relatively quickly was actually got a grant from the New York Community Trust. And within about 6 weeks, we had developed a website for teachers called Partners in Healing, where they were able to pull down exercises and activities, both for themselves and for their virtual classrooms, that they could implement some of the practices that we would have done had we been in person. And that was a big sort of shift in that part of the work. But our work with students and families, really went from some of the things that they were, most engaged in to suddenly being about like getting people connected to resources, whether that be the internet. At some point it was food. We did a lot of food connection. Okay. At some point we were doing a lot of things that we had. We started a partnership with an organization called Everest Effect, which was set up to provide resources in areas where there had been some kind of natural disaster. So they had this great distribution network that was able to deliver. We created sort of these packages that we could send out to students and families that would have things like art supplies for kids to use, or, physical fitness things. Or even in the very beginning, we did things with, wipes and disinfectants and just basics, that because they had access to this Everest Effect group had access to Walmart, and they were one of their distributors, and we were able to tap into that and send people the Lysol and all of the things at the very beginning that was, everybody was really concerned. Are we going to get, and they were being hoarded, right? Toilet paper, like the basics.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it. But, you brought up a really good point that I myself didn't really consider either, is around the physical activity portion, because I've said to you before, I have a 1-year-old. So, he's always on the move, but now we're talking about kids that are in middle school and elementary school or high school. And that now they can't get that physical activity that they need. And now that's another bucket, Kevin, that I didn't think about, and how much that can affect them. And then what do you do with that? Like, I can't even, I'm trying to wrap my head around like, what would be some activities that what would that even look like to be able to facilitate that? Obviously it could go, some people don't live in safe neighborhoods. Now that I think about it, I was going to say people could go in their driveway, but everybody has a driveway.
No, it's not driveway, so yeah, we did, record some things,
cool.
And send them out. I think of one of our, dance and movement therapists did a whole thing actually for what you could do while sitting in a chair, or just within the same space occupied by a chair, because we also know that the apartments that, students live in, it's not like they're going to, pull over their Peloton and go for a run. Right? So, there's certainly lots of things proliferated on the internet, on YouTube, to sort of work out and whatever, but we wanted things that were sort of connected, and the younger age group was the one that, we thought a lot about also, because, for the young ones, sometimes they have toys and stuff around the house, but, parents had to work, parents had to do things, parents had to sort of figure it out, or, the parent wasn't there. And so now an older child was watching a younger child in the home all day. Whereas maybe they were used to doing that for an hour or two at a time, but now they were doing it like, 24/7 because no one was leaving the house.
Yeah. It's a different thing.
It's a very different thing. Right. And so, as a parent of a 1-year-old, and my kids are grown, but I'm sure, it's nice to have a break once in a while, isn't it?
It is. Yes. Few and far between, but it is nice, to kind of have that. And then that's a big burden emotionally, on a kid to now be in an environment where they're having to do that and play a role that they not necessarily need to really be playing. They should be able to focus on other things. And you made me think of too, kind of fighting against during the pandemic, a lot of companies use that as an opportunity to advertise things that pretty much like only middle or upper middle class people or upper class people could afford, right? So now you have kids that are exposed to all these things that they can't even have.
Yeah, no, that's a great, that's always the case, but in this case, there was so much more sort of captive, for lack of a better phrase, right, into that space. And there was a lot of concern about, the marketing of things to young kids that might be able to afford it, but also then the impact on who couldn't and what they would do. So, I mean, we really found that great success in being able to send things so that, and secondly, I know I experienced this when I was younger, and I think I still to this day, and it got a little tired during the pandemic. But when you get a package in the mail, when you're not used to getting a package in the mail, it's kind of cool, right? Like you're like, oh, there's a box of stuff for me. And it was simple things, right? I mean, these were not, the things that they were watching advertised on television. But for a middle school kid, there was, an exercise band and, a different kind of, manipulative or a puzzle or different things that, they could just get engaged in. That would be, a little bit of instruction. And here, tune into this video and look at this and look at that. So you still know that, hey, someone's out there thinking about me, and this is something different for me to do. And it's taking a burden off of parents to have to figure it out 24/7.
That's hard. Activities 24/7.
Activities 24/7. And, and then when you're not connected to the internet or, at the very beginning, there was a lot of challenges for even those Google Classrooms or Zoom platforms to actually work, even when you had the connection, right? I mean, the city wasn't prepared for this. So, families would get discouraged, kids would get discouraged. They would not have a class all day.
Right. And there's no timeline, right? So it's like trying to also develop things. And how do we stay connected for X amount of time? What does that look like? How do we keep coming up and continue to be innovative? And, what I'm taking away from what you're saying is obviously, again, prioritizing like that connection at the center. But then some of it too is just being aware, right? You all were aware of how important that connection is at the base, rather than maybe prioritizing things like, how do we make sure that they know how to do math from home? How do we make sure like some of these things that are important, but like at the core, it's like connection. Because if we can't connect to them or empathize or be able for them to feel seen, how, setting up a computer and saying, do this math problem probably isn't going to land.
That's such a core message that I'm so glad you're putting out there, Kat. Bottle that. Like, let's put that out there. I just, I couldn't say it any better. It's really, I think, at the core of counseling in schools. And when I think about, again, the concept of pivot, we actually did some, thought a lot about what it meant to pivot. And when you do pivot, you sort of have a focal point, right? You pivot from a place. It's not just crazy movement. And I think that connectivity, that point of connection was if we had that, the rest we were going to figure out. Like the rest, we would swivel around, we would adjust. We might be at 8:00 at night when we're doing our thing. It might be, on the Saturday, we might have nothing going on from 10 to 2, which during regular school would have been our main hours. But between 2 and 6, we've got a lot going on now, because that's when, things can work in a home and so on and so, or for a child. And so those were the things that, we needed to do. But we needed to stay connected to that core of relationship and connectivity, and however we could get it.
Right. And the need for you all, I think, heightened, right? Because, kids, families, to the point you made earlier, like it hasn't changed that families are struggling in a variety of ways. But now it's in the forefront where it almost is like, and we've talked about this in past episodes, that connection between what, you all offer and getting on the same page with like school and come meeting in the middle, like that we've learned how important that actually is. Because you can't have them you can't have, counseling and support isolated from trying to learn and education.
Right. Yeah. And I think that awareness, like you said, it expanded, and it was there. It is more intense. Certainly for a lot of families, it's more intense. There is, we have children who multiple family members died from COVID in the early weeks. We have young people who were, living with grandparents who then were not going to live with grandparents because of concern for the disease, or they were, separated families where children arrangements were all kind of set. And one in particular I'm thinking of, we worked with a family, and the young boy needed to young girl actually switched from living with her father to a grandparent because her father was worked in a hospital, and he was needed every day in the hospital, and he didn't want to come home and expose his son, and so for the safety of his son, he had to move from that experience to live with an extended family, or she rather, with an extended family member, and that was really traumatic for her. This was an extended family member that she had some history with that not a lot of people knew about, and that was really hard for her.
That's a big deal.
Right. And so there were these displacements and replacements and things that people just sort of thought like, well, you do what you got to do. But the impact on some of the children, in that particular case I'm thinking of, really got intense for that young woman. And we were able to support her through that, and the family and the father, and everybody then was able to come together and sort of figure out an even better solution, or at least she felt heard in the scenario. But we don't know, how many of those kind of things they're sort of countless,
right?
That people went through. But again, we wanted to sort of, center ourselves in those relationships so that we could see what was happening. But there was an intensity. I mean, I don't want to sort of lose the point that COVID did turn up the volume on all of these things. It just didn't create them in the way that sometimes I fear.
You're not new.
People, right. Because my fear is that, knock on wood, where we go to a COVID-free environment at some point, then the idea would be like, well, that's over. We can go back to the way things were. And the silver lining here, if there is one, is that these needs and these things were there before, and they're going to need as many resources when COVID is gone as they do right now. So let's get this formula right. Let's get the resource, distribution right. Let's figure out the pivots and anything else that needs to happen, and the equity issues in place. Because, if we do find our way out of this pandemic, then, I want to be able to sort of move forward with some advancement for everybody, not regress back to where we were before, just waiting for the next challenge to come and exacerbate itself into the most vulnerable communities again.
Right. It's the power of the pivot and learning from this and being able to move forward. So when something that this, once in a lifetime thing happens again, which we really don't know, we're better prepared, and we are more aware, and we can stay connected and prioritize the things probably even a little bit quicker. And then on the flip side of it too, it is easy for people to be like, oh, you just got to do what you got to do, be in survival mode. And oftentimes I think as a society, we have a habit of not understanding the value of in the fact that someone's experience doesn't just stop after you've survived something.
Right.
Their experience is still impacting them. Okay. So we have to grow from this, because it doesn't just because things may seem like they're normal. That's not reality, and that's not for everybody. I call it the afterglow. It's not too much of a glow for a lot of people. It's actually dimmer. And these are lifelong trauma people are going to have to deal with. And this whole, just got to make it through mindset, I feel like we're past that. You don't have to just make it through. We want to come out of it better and move forward better.
Hallelujah.
We're on the same page, Kevin.
100%. No, that's right. That's right. And I'm glad that we can, try to sort of have this message. I do think when folks sort of hear that and think about it, it makes sense. And I think, the other side of it is that we're also wanting to be past something, right? You want it to
Definitely.
Just be over. And yes, I want it to be over too. But like you said, we want to come out of this stronger and better, and bringing something forward with us that's of value. And there are things here of value to bring forward.
Definitely. Well, Kevin, it's been a pleasure. We are out of time, but you, as usual, you're leaving me with more ideas for more conversation. So I look forward to it. Thank you, listeners. This is your host, Kat Potts. Kevin, thank you again, and we'll have you on next time.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Counseling in Schools is able to provide comprehensive services throughout New York City partner schools with your generous donations. Learn more about how you can be part of the journey as we promote healing and inspire hope in children by visiting counselinginschools.org.